On Friday the 23rd of September, Kwasi Kwarteng, the new Chancellor, introduced a raft of tax cuts for high earners, with cuts in corporation tax and an energy price guarantee. One of the most consequential budgets in many years, the second biggest tax giveaway since the barber boom of the early 70s. Even as he announced his tax cuts, the market reacted adversely. The pound plummeted, gilt yields rose, and there was the biggest sell-off of UK government bonds for decades, ending 15 years of comatose bond markets where interest rates were close to zero. It led to a rare rebuke from the IMF, which argued that given the high inflation in the UK, such poorly targeted tax cuts were undesirable. Others were even more straight-talking. The former US Treasury Secretary, Larry Summers, argued that the budget was totally irresponsible and the UK was behaving like an emerging market, becoming a submerging market. Some city traders were even more forthright, arguing the government was behaving like a doomsday cult, pursuing fantasy economics and trashing the government's reputation unnecessarily. What went wrong? Why did things unravel so quickly? Why have we entered into a crisis of our own making? Well, first of all, the UK economy has been doing relatively poorly for quite a few years. Ever since the great financial crisis, growth rates have been low, productivity very poor, and the UK has been slipping behind its main competitors. As a result, the pound has been on a long-term decline for quite a few years, and in the past 16 months, the decline has accelerated, the sterling falling over 16% this year, and although it's fallen less against the euro, it's still down against a basket of currencies. Also, debt has been rising because of the great financial crisis, then COVID, and it's forecast to soar in the coming years because of demographic factors. On top of that, we've had the war in the Ukraine pushing up cost-push inflation to the highest level since the 1990s. And this cost-push inflation has caused real economic pain with falling real wages, and many households struggle to paying their bills. Nevertheless, if you look at the bond market was very unconcerned about the government situation. Bond yields were around 2%, which is very low by historical standards. So what went wrong? Well, first of all, the budget was unprecedented in its scope of tax cuts, over 35 billion of unfunded tax cuts. And this, combined with the energy price guarantee, is likely to cause UK borrowing to almost double, from around £99 billion to £190 billion. But the Chancellor didn't want the Office of Budget Responsibility to pursue any forecasts or plans on how to make debt sustainable. So markets have been very concerned about this sudden rise in UK debt that will increase inflationary pressures, because by cutting tax, some people will have more money to spend, causing more inflation. So the markets are concerned about inflation, but also they predict that the bank will have to increase interest rates. And they'll have to increase interest rates for two reasons. Firstly, inflation is a real problem. Inflation is over 10%, but the bank's target is 2%. This budget only increases inflationary pressures. Secondly, the fall in the value of a pound is starting to be a real problem. It's reducing living standards, increasing the cost of imports, and increasing inflationary pressures. So the bank will have to increase interest rates, and markets are predicting around 5 or 6%. But at the same time, if a bank increases interest rates, this will also be devastating for the economy, because it will lead to higher mortgage payments, a fall in house prices, and many households will actually be worse off. Because another feature about the tax cuts is that they were focused very heavily on high income earners. In fact, the majority of households are going to be worse off because the tax cuts have very little benefit to them, but they'll be facing higher prices, higher cost of living, and will still see falling real wages. So the UK is left with a very unwelcome situation that the UK economy is likely to go in recession with high inflation. Another aspect of the budget was the unexpected cut in the top rate of income tax of 45%. And this will of course benefit the city traders the most. They're most likely to be earning high incomes. Yet because it was unannounced, it was a symbolic that this government isn't worried about borrowing and it's going to pursue highly ideological tax cuts, no matter if they're unpopular or poorly targeted or increase the deficit. On its own, the tax cuts don't actually cost a huge amount, in the region of around £2.5 billion. But this, on top of all the other fiscal expansion, has left markets concerned about the unsustainable rise in debt. Another feature about the budget is that both Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng were unashamed in believing strongly in the ideology of trickle-down economics, supply-side economics, where they argue that tax cuts for corporations and high earners is necessary to boost economic growth rates in the UK. This was an argument popularised by Ronald Reagan in the early 1980s, and he cut taxes quite a lot, causing a big budget deficit. And they hope to emulate Ronald Reagan, this kind of supply-side economics. The problem is that although most city traders probably like tax cuts, they're also aware that this is really fantasy economics. There's no strong evidence that tax cuts boost long-term rates of economic growth. It's much more difficult. You need long-term policies to increase investment, increase productivity, better education, better healthcare. And there's no magic bullet where cutting tax rates suddenly leads to higher growth and higher tax revenues. So there's a certain arrogance from both Truss and Kwarteng that the tax cuts would pay for themselves through higher growth. But apart from one or two economists, the vast majority are aware that this simply won't happen. The UK economy is not going to be turned around by tax cuts for high earners. And if you're interested, there's a video here I made about trickle-down economics, which goes into this in more detail. Now, in economics, personalities usually aren't too important, but in this case I think it is, because both Kwarteng and Truss made no secret of the fact that they didn't value the advice of so-called economic experts. The first action of Kwasi Kwarteng on becoming Chancellor was to sack the highly respected civil servant Sir Tom Scholar. And the reason is that Sir Tom Scholar is exactly the kind of civil servant who would say, you need some kind of budget. You can't just give unfunded tax cuts. But Kwarteng didn't want to hear this, because they strongly believe in the ideology of tax cuts and free market economics. And the irony is that just because you believe in free market economics doesn't mean the free market will like you. And this is shown by the response of the market. And even after the pound fell on Friday and gilt rose, the reaction of Kwarteng on the weekend was to double down and say, I will cut more taxes in the spring. And this bluster, unfortunately, doesn't go down well with markets. So as a result of this market crisis, we've had the rare case of the Bank of England intervening to stabilise pension funds. This week, the bank is spending around £65 billion on buying government bonds to protect the value of bonds in pension funds. I could go into a lot of detail, but it gets quite complicated. But the irony is that recently, the Bank of England were pursuing quantitative tightening, selling off all the bonds they bought during the last recession. But now, because of the crisis, they're going back to quantitative easing, creating money to buy bonds. And this will provide some stability to the markets. But the problem is, it's only a short-term stopgap, giving the government more time. Because if you pursue quantitative easing, it only puts more downward pressure on sterling, because you're increasing the supply of currency, and it could cause inflationary pressures. Are there any mitigating factors to this market crisis? Some say that most of the announcements were pre-made. How come the market reacted so badly? And one or two have humorously suggested that it's the market's sudden realisation that in 2 years' time a Labour government is inevitable. Nobody actually believes this, but a stronger case is that the government of the UK economy is struggling because it faces higher US interest rates and a strong US economy. And this is causing pressure for many economies with weak currencies. And so certainly this is one of the long-term factors that this year has been hard for the UK. But it's the pound has not just fallen against the dollar, but also against other currencies, to a lesser extent. But the crisis is entirely manufactured in the UK. No other country is experiencing what the UK is going through at the moment. A bigger question is, what are the long-term implications of this crisis? Well, unfortunately, they're not good. Just very quickly, I will tell you. Firstly, we're likely to see higher interest rates. This will cause higher mortgage payments, falling house prices, and this will cause a very big negative effect on economic growth. Secondly, we may see higher debt interest payments in the long term because of a higher yield premium on UK gilts. Thirdly, we're likely to see a weaker pound. All this puts more downward pressure on sterling, which in turn increases the price of imports and increases inflationary pressures. And finally, it does make a recession imminent. And the irony is that a budget going for growth could cause so much market turmoil and risk the fact of pushing the UK into recession. So it's a very unfortunate situation, and the government should really just U-turn, abandon its last budget, keep the energy price guarantee, but get rid of the Chancellor and start again. I don't know whether they'll do that, it's unlikely. But it's quite a serious event. There's lots more to talk about, but that's enough for today. Hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the Economics Help channel. Lots more great videos coming soon. Thank you.